Hello, everybody. The soundtrack is gone. I'm glad to welcome you all here by behalf of Department of Architecture of Estonian Academy Awards. Thanks to the Cultural Endowment of Estonia, we have been running this lecture series. It turns out already 10 academic years. So this is a remarkable continuity that we are trying to go further with. Also starting today with the 21st season of lecture series. And what is new this time around are two things that we want to emphasize. Firstly, we will be now curating the lecture series more in topic-driven way. As you might have noticed also this semester. Previously, it started already last semester with looking at into healing architecture, looking into Baltic bubble. So this semester continues with the topic Warum Berlin. And the other important change is also the fact that we have a season-based, semester-based curating, and the curators will be either the doctoral students, the researchers of our department, and I think now it's the right time to invite here the curator of this semester, Johan Tali, with the topic of Warum Berlin.
Yeah, it's a good question. Why Berlin? We can consider Berlin one of the most exciting multicultural metropolises in Europe. A city that has many similarities to, for example, Tallinn. It is loaded. On one hand, due to its tragic past and the wounds of which have to be actively dealt with in the urban space. On the other hand, due to the hundreds of communities of different cultures gathering in Berlin. And the result is one of the largest culturally diverse hotspots in Europe. Multicultural Berlin can be seen as one of the prototypes of an urbanized society of the future, where an eco-warrior futurist meets a techno-utopian bohemian. Berlin's wide array of spatial practices play an important role in steering change, constantly redefining what we consider important in urban space and environments. Today, we welcome Jan Edler from the Realities United. Jan, together with his brother Tim, co-founded the transdisciplinary art group Kunst and Technik in 1997, originally operating in Berlin. They went on to create the art and architecture studio Realities United in 2000. The studio has gained international recognition with art and hybrid art installations on an architectural and urban scale. Please join me welcoming Jan Edler. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Zille, Johan, everybody else. Why Berlin? This put me to a riddle, really, and to try to make sense. I thought that I try to bring stuff that somehow relates us and our work to Berlin. So it's going to be a tour, rather quick and dirty, and sometimes fast and not very much in depth, but trying to do the circle that is maybe also behind our studio. What we see here is the Museum Island, or the Spree Island, in the very city center of Berlin. And that's where I started working together with my brother Tim, right next to the Bode Museum. There used to be a former animal testing lab of Charité Hospital, and we started using this leftover foundation of a building in the end 90s to to work together and found this group Kunst and Technik that Johan mentioned. So that's the building that you see here. It was an experiment, no heating, no windows, no infrastructure. So the building itself was the project itself, and it served as a studio space, as an exhibition space, doing different projects. Like here's an installation by Jonathan Garnham, a member of the group from South Africa, who flooded one of our spaces with spray water. And probably the most successful project of that time was behind this door on the outside of the building, which was one of the typical illegal nightclubs in Berlin. A thing to have, but most importantly, communication space to meet other people and to exchange ideas. So in that context, I bumped into my brother after a long period of being divided to different places in Germany or in Europe. And somehow we started to work together. And I'm going to show you very old stuff in the beginning. Some of it might be a bit embarrassing looking back, but it belongs to the journey. So coming from this party background, the bar or the club, you have to understand, was quite successful. In the beginning, it was open every Wednesday. When it got too crowded, it became the 6 bar, open on every day, divisible by 6. So the weekday would change from week to week in order to make it more complicated for tourists to find it. And at the same time, this was going on in Berlin. You might remember these images, the Love Parade. And I'm showing that because I think our early work was very much inspired not only by forming a group like Kunst und Technik, having a building that we transformed, but also kind of watching the city around us and how it was transforming. And the Love Parade itself was, of course, a rather interesting event, bringing so many people to Berlin for enjoying themselves and dancing. At the same time, this event was also a big disappointment because the format behind it was so stupid and limited. You know, like these big trucks moving through large crowds of people and bringing sound to them. And so one of these very, very early projects I'm showing you was the attempt to transform the Love Parade in Berlin to become a mixture of a lifestyle event, an open-air dance event, and a technology fair. We thought in order to make an event like that survive to the future, that it should be transformed to become a place where the big partners of the industry join and invent mobile sound systems which make it enjoyable to have stereo sound on the street instead of mono. So things like that. That's a very early experiment. It never happened. We developed that for the Club Tresor in Berlin, but couldn't get the money together to construct it. As you can see, it's regular construction site vehicles being transformed to form this moving stereo dance floor. More music from the time. Of course, the other surrounding that was driving us quite a bit was our own living conditions. And Berlin at that time was having a lot of gaps, and it was easy to find housing, and it was cheap. And so here what you can see is a prototype of something that we imagine to become a serial product for buildings that don't have a balcony. It's actually operating on the legal limits of architecture because, of course, you cannot attach a balcony to a building without a permit and planning. But as this device is only attached to the inside of the building and it's only temporary, you don't need permission. I think you get the idea The guy looks very relaxed, as you can see. Yeah, so funny old stuff, and maybe it took a bit, but somehow it relates to a lot of stuff we did later on and that developed. And that was coined very much by the idea of understanding that you have architecture and you have these early visions that you can see here from the 60s archigram of architecture becoming dynamic and changeable entity. So maybe that was something which was also behind a project like the Rheinraus chair I just showed, like a transforming space. Of course, at the same time, digital technologies were evolving and coming around and promising other means of transforming space. And it looks like it's all meant to be parallel, but I think it's more like coincidence, like years later you look at what you have done and somehow it fits together. But there was no master plan in the beginning. And so the idea to expand the physical space by means of digital technologies was something that was driving us quite early. So you saw this video I showed in the very beginning of Jackie Chan deconstructing his own image that comes from a research project that we were doing in the late 90s, where we actually tried to transform a museum space for an exhibition of an art collector to become some sort of experimental augmented reality setup where you could have a parallel data exhibition that you could rearrange in the museum. And here you see an experiment we did a bit later at the Deichtorhallen in Hamburg, and where we experimented with mobile video communication in the exhibition space. So that was in the late 90s, where it was still quite difficult to actually do things like that, because the technology wasn't there. But it was driven by this potential that we were seeing behind technologies, digital technologies coming around and augmenting the physical space that we would experience in the future. That's also the reason why our studio is called Realities United, because we thought at that time that we would specialize in that field. Years later, we learned that we wouldn't, and we did all kinds of stuff continuing, but that was the idea behind it. And in a way, if you look at Rheinraus, at the chair I just showed, you can of course see something like a balcony chair or balcony behind it, but you could also see that it's something like a 1-pixel media facade. It just has 1 pixel, but it's changing. And while all your neighbors are connecting to the world and watch television, you're the one who really sees the world. So that brings me to a different scale at a different time, but which relates to each other somehow, which is this building. This was our first project where we were able to realize ideas at a larger scale, the Kunsthaus Graz by Peter Cook and Colin Fournier, which was erected for the celebrations of the European Cultural Capital in Graz in 2003. And a school friend of mine is actually the design architect behind this building, Niels Jonkans. And he called us one day and he said, "You are kind of doing things with technology and space, and we need technology in this building. It's going to be super modern, and somehow media technology must be included." And so he got us on board. We won a commission by the city to develop what was called a conception for the integration of media technology for this building. And nobody knew really what a conception for the integration of media technology for this was supposed to contain. It was just kind of driven by rather this idea it's a futuristic building and it needs to have future technologies inside somehow. And so we developed a catalog of ideas, and the most unlikely idea became reality. And this was an idea which was looking at the transformation of the architecture which took place between the win of the competition and the realization project. And this is an early rendering of this building. And as you can still see that at least here the roof landscape of that building, which is cladded in perspex, was supposed to be transparent. And in the very early stage of the design of this project, parts of this facade of the Kunst house were supposed to be transparent in order to enable a direct communication between the inside and the outside. So there was no commission to look at the facade specifically, but we proposed a concept to make this become reality, even if in a mediated way, because throughout realization, the architects needed to realize that a building on the southern side of the Alps, looking at sun radiation and heat radiation, could not be constructed as a transparent organism, but it was becoming a black box. But they were keeping alive the idea of cladding it in a transparent material. And so we thought maybe we should try to bring back this communicative capacity of the architecture into the project and propose to integrate a field of 930 standard fluorescent light tubes into the facade. You can control, that means dim them individually, and thereby the facade, the main facade of the building, is transformed to become a very low resolution but a very integrated screen for that specific building. So a way for the art institution to communicate with the outside world. So this project was published quite a bit, and it was interesting working on a project like that because of it was at that time there was not many buildings in the world with I would say surfaces that you could alter at that scale and which were not under commercial pressure. Usually everything we knew at that time was commercial billboards, and of course they needed to generate money. And out of this kind of view on the Kunsthaus, we got commissions to do several similar projects, and usually they were all starting with this idea of, can we have something like in Graz as well? And that wasn't very interesting to us, so we tried to find like this research bubble within that setting, and that was kind of looking at what is a pixel in architecture maybe. We didn't know that at that time, but it was kind of looking at the idea of if architecture becomes dynamic, if something like a screen is integrated in physical space, how does it look like and what does it tell? What is the story? How does it communicate? How do these pixels arrive in the architecture? So this was a follow-up project in Berlin, a temporary thing where we shifted pixels and used different shapes of pixels, still using fluorescent light tubes. Then we started experimenting with pixels that became three-dimensional. Here again, that's a project in Singapore. There was a building and there was a client, and they were constructing a glass facade in front of a building without any windows for us to put fluorescent light tubes behind it because they wanted to be modern and have dynamic skin. So we persuaded them to say, why couldn't we go a step further and do something which is also relevant at daytime, cladding this building and these elements that contain light elements. Actually, a project which failed from my perspective quite a bit in this series of experiments because we as in Graz, had the idea that here it should be a laboratory for an art school in Singapore to use it to develop language, grammar, content for that facade, which never happened. So it was something which was constructed and never really used in Singapore. And then maybe the last one in the series, the most radical one and the most beautiful one, I just heard that Enrique Sobejano was here to present their work. We collaborated with Nieto Sobejano architects on this project. Again, here the architects got us on board in order to integrate circular fluorescent light tubes. And then we transformed the facade, looking at the footprint of that building, which was organized around these, you can't really say, it's not tessellation patterns. It looks like tessellation patterns, but they're not mathematically correct. So it's rather an aesthetic pattern of the footprint of that museum building in Cordoba in Spain, and we used that format or these formalistic elements and transferred it onto the facade here to make that facade become dynamic. Here again, it was an art institution, and the idea was that the people or the artists working on the inside should have a tool to communicate with the city of Graz. Maybe a few more words about this facade, because I think it's the most interesting one. It was, looking at the scale of the building, the most difficult situation, because the building is very long but not very high. It only has a height of 11 meters, but is 110 meters long. And at the time, and looking at these experiments, using big off-the-shelf products in order to construct screens, of course, every pixel costs money. So each pixel is relevant in the end, not only by the means of constructing something where you can, in the end, show something or that is capable of showing images or whatsoever, but also by budget. And if you have large pixels, of course, you have only very little density of information in the height of the building, a lot of density in the length of the building. And so here, this was an experiment which was looking at the way our mechanism of seeing the world is working, where our eye has very high density receptors in the center of the eye, so there we receive a lot of information, and while in the periphery of the eye we only have little receptors, but the brain puts together the image because we have experience in viewing. And that was the attempt, what we tried here. So we started not only to use this irregular pattern of pixels, but we looked at the possibility to have different densities of information, where you can see it has high density of information in the center of the facade and lower density on the outskirts of the facade. And then coming together, and hopefully, because you couldn't simulate that on a screen, working in reality. Maybe we can look at some images here at a video. So you see it's a concrete facade, so it's completely different to the other ones. These bolts, how we call them, are made from white concrete. They're illuminated from the side. It's 1,300 something pixels in that case. And what I was just referring to, it was difficult to think a project like that and simulate it on the screen, because you can't. You can only evaluate it in the real scale, because the pixels on a computer screen, they grow together, and of course you don't know how the trick will work in the end. So that gives you an impression that even though the facade is very long and not very high, it's still capable of transporting quite a bit of information in there. And then there's like a build joke, this giant pixel, which is on the full height of the building integrated in that. So You know that, or you might know that. I'm not really sure if that is an element you're familiar with very much in this part. But this used to be the typical kitchen lamp that you would have in Germany when you grow up. And so this element suddenly became this driving force behind developing facades like that. So it was something which was very unlikely to work in the beginning and took a lot of research in order to make it happen in the end. So that was something where I believe it's part of the success, if you want to say, of these projects, because we took something which was old and dying already at that time. So it moved the evaluation of a project like that outside of the realm of high technology, like the evaluation of screens, as you know from your smartphone and so on. It's like contrast, resolution, number of colors, fastness, and so on. So we kind of threw overboard all of these in order to achieve something else, which was scale, integration, or integratability into architecture, into space. Doing something which would deny to be used by putting any content on it, but which would be saying, which was looking at the situation to say, we need special content that needs to be developed site-specific, as every building is also site-specific. So that was one branch which I think is important behind the series of projects, or one aspect. Another aspect was, this is another example actually here. It's an advertising format you might recall, scrolling billboards. Before LED screens hit, you had scrolling billboards that could show 3 or 4 commercials after each other being rolled up, basically, on paper. So here they become part of a building site art installation for Diller's Cathedral building in Providence in the USA. It's just changing color, so it's color coding the entrance very, very slowly. Hardly ever noticed by the people using the building because it's happening at nighttime. So again, using technology which was already old and not evaluated based up on current technologies as this one. I'm not going into detail. This is an installation we did for the Guangzhou Biennale in, I think, 2017 or 18, a rooftop installation together with Moon Hoon, an architect from Korea. And it's using TriVision, which is again an advertising format which allows you to store 3 images. And here you see you can only alter the color but not the message. It's a project about reflecting up on the possibilities of the social media you're all carrying in your pocket, which promise you that you can change everything, but you're only working within the limits of the technical system itself. And while using these old technologies, things off the shelf, another thing came up. Of course, we started to wonder, why do we actually do this? Add all this technology to building while we are looking at a built environment which includes more and more technology already, because it's servicing. And so we started to look at a series of projects where we started, where we tried to instrumentalize the technology which was needed inside and make it do something else, something additional. Here's an installation for the art school in Zurich, where all the art universities found a new home in a former yogurt factory, and where we transformed the 2,500 square meter half public space, which is also at the same time the exhibition space for the students, by putting in an unusual lighting system, I would say, which triggers the students to conquer that space. That's the idea behind it. So you have dark zones and you have very bright zones. all of them don't really suit very well as an exhibition space, and they don't suit very well as public space. So they trigger the students to take the space and transform it to their needs. At a smaller scale, using anyhow technology, again, a lighting project in Toronto, a building site art installation again. It's called Lightspell. It was constructed or finished in 2017 for a subway station by Will Alsop, the last project he completed, I believe. And here it's a system of 40 chandeliers that illuminate the platform level of the station. And there's several of these computer terminals, and you can write text. Each chandelier is a 16-segment display. And so you can basically program simple messages to illuminate the platform level of that station. Just 3 days before the opening of the building, we learned that the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, said they are not going to take it, they're not going to use it, because they were afraid of hate speech and said it can't be used. So we have been in a negotiation process since 2017 now in order to take this finished project into operation and develop new software and so on. It's quite a complicated project. So this project started in 2009, just to give you an idea, when we first developed the idea, and so a lot of things have happened. Or another project which looks at infrastructure or things, anyhow technology, is this very small installation for an art museum in Germany, Magdeburg, a small city in eastern or former eastern Germany, and here the sun shading system of the building is serving as an art installation on one hand in a heritage protected building, and the vehicle via the art world enabled the museum to become visible to the outside, which otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And here another project from this transforming of infrastructure is a waste-to-energy plant by Bjarke Ingels, architects in Copenhagen. We collaborated on the competition of this project, and one part of the proposal was to transform the smokestack of that waste-to-energy plant to blow smoke rings. And the idea behind it was that Bjarke Ingels proposed a plant, something usually fenced off in an industrial area, to become public space and to have a skiing hill on top of that building. That is actually existing in Copenhagen. For all of you who haven't been there, you can go skiing there now, on top of that waste-to-energy plant. And it was supposed to be the most efficient waste-to-energy plant in the world. So there was no toxic fumes coming out anymore on the top. And so for us, this perspective was too good to be true, in a sense, because we thought you can really get on the wrong track here, I would say. Get on the wrong track by the sense that you could have the idea that burning waste is really cool. I mean, you have heat, you have energy, and the more we throw away, the bigger the hill gets, the better the skiing gets. And there's no toxic fumes, so what is wrong? But of course, the problem here is that we still have CO2 emission, which is not being talked about. So the idea about this project was to make the CO2 emission of this plant just 4.5 kilometers from the city center of Copenhagen communicate the amount of CO2 it's emitting into its environment. So each ring in Copenhagen would have had 0.5 ton of CO2, 30 meters in diameter. Each of these rings coming out at intervals about of 30 seconds from that plant. So a solemn procession of the leftovers of our society going into the sky. Skiing is really good. Long distance communication. You saw these video footage of real smoke rings. They were shot at Mount Etna in Italy. So these rings do exist in reality, and it's a thing which happens very seldomly, but it happens. And the fascinating thing is that they become incredibly stable. By the rotating gas in these clouds, they become very stable against any side winds. So they stay visible in the sky for several minutes. So it's a perfect means of long-distance communication. Actually, what you see here is a manipulated image taken from an aeroplane. And what you see there is a cloud of a cooling tower from a power plant underneath. So it's a low cloudy day with low clouds. And so the plum of that cooling tower is actually visible from above. This is a research project we just started lately. We couldn't realize the smoke rings in Copenhagen, but the phenomena of these smoke rings, or steam rings in this case of this project, never left us. And so this is a project we are working on. We kickstarted that 2 years or 2.5 years ago with a solo exhibition at the Berlinische Galerie, an art museum in Berlin, where we decided to transform the museum space into a discussion space around that project. It's called Fazit, and it's a cultural project to accompany the energy transition in Germany. So as you might know, and it's all in flux right now due to the latest developments, but the big thermal power plants, that includes nuclear power, but also coal-based power, will be closed down in Germany sooner or later. And the social process that has led for this to happen was a very long thing. You know, it was a process which took decades, and it left behind people with very mixed feelings. So there is a side of society who's very much in favor of like going away from fossil fuels and atomic power, and then there's the other ones who believe very much in security of energy production and provision in the future. And in order to think the alternative, which we need to come up and which we don't know as a society, we thought it might be good to have like this this kind of event which brings together these parties, these sides in society, and to discuss how the future should look like and how we can provide or produce the energy that we need for the future. "20 more minutes I have. As I said, not very much order, not much order in this lecture, but trying to take a start in Berlin, trying to take a detour to the work we have done. That was a snippet from what we have done over the last 20 years, bringing me back to the very start of the lecture and also our studio. And you might recall that here, I don't know if there's a laser pointer here. Doesn't matter. Our first studio was there on the opposite side of the Bode Museum. Actually, there. And in the late 90s, when we started working there together, one project started which is still ongoing, or which is again ongoing, or which hopefully will become reality one day. And that is looking at the so-called Spreekanal in the city center of Berlin. It's called Flussbad Berlin. As I said, it has a very long history. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but what you need to understand in order to get a picture is that we started that as like a love parade idea, or as like the concept to develop a accompanying project for the energy transition in Germany, it's all projects which come about without a commission. Even the Kunsthaus Graz project, the facade, there was no commission to do a facade like that. It was a commission to do something else. So this is very typical. It's like what we call potential-driven design, watching the world around us and see how could we make use of the potentials which are there but which are not being used. And this is the very oldest, or the oldest project of that kind, which had the offspring in the late 90s when we had this club and the studio in the center of Berlin. And somehow this project is called Flussbad Berlin, so swimming pool Berlin, stupid name. And looks at the idea of using this canal that you just saw to become swimmable. And that was an image which was at the time somehow attractive to the press. So it became a lot of attention. The project got a lot of attention at the time. But there was no client, there was no realistic vision that a project like this could become reality. And so we carried on with this project as a hobby. And then there was kind of a game changer when the project was awarded with the Lafarge-Holcim Award from Switzerland for Europe, and won the main prize. So that's an award for sustainable architecture and urban development projects, and which understands itself as an award to kickstart projects which are not really there yet. They are like maybe close to realization, but they're not really there yet. Our project was not there at all. It was just a concept on paper. And by winning this award from the recognition from a different country, from Switzerland, this project somehow got more momentum in Berlin. It was taken more serious. And we took this as an opportunity to found a non-profit organization, which I'm also working for part-time. It's part of my professional life. I work half-time for our studio and half-time for this NGO. And this NGO is now trying to make this project for Berlin become reality. And we thought that it's more suitable to have this project backdropped by society, or to give it a chance to become reality by becoming a project by the people. And so that was in 2012. So we had the 10th anniversary this year. And then we started to acquire funding for the project. And so the project has been state and country funded since 2014 and 15 in order to further develop the project. And I'm going to walk you through the Spreekanal in the city center of Berlin. Used to be the main traffic route through Berlin, so that's where Berlin was born somehow. As you can say, it was built from the ship. And this was a very busy road. There is documents which say that at the time, approximately 100 years ago, it was 6 days waiting at the lock to get through this canal because it was so heavily used by transportation. The possibility to think about using the Spreekanal for something else beyond shipping that evolved around the historic development, because in former times, or like in general, Berlin has always treated its natural waterways or its artificial waterways in a very pragmatic way. So if you didn't need something anymore, like on the upper left you see 1680, Berlin had a defense ring, a typical water ring around the old part of the kernel of the city. When defense was not needed anymore, they filled that part of the city or the water system, and it became the ground for public transportation, where the S-Bahn is riding today. So that's the lower right picture where you see that on that plot of land, because a space was there in the city fabric, the S-Bahn could be constructed. And shipping approximately 100 years ago was moved to the main river Spree. That was blocked beforehand by mills, which were needed to produce energy. Then the steam engine was invented, and that freed that space to be used by something else. So the project divides the length of this canal area where there is no shipping anymore since approximately 100 years, because there is no lock anymore. So the shipping is only going through the main Spree today. And the project divides that canal into 3 areas. There's a name-giving one, which is the swimming area, which you can see here between Bode Museum and Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Ministry. That's a length of about 830 meters. Here we want to have clean water to have the possibility to go swimming. Then there is a filter section in the center of the project, roughly 400 meters long between the Foreign Ministry and Leipziger Straße or Gertrauden Bridge. And then there is the uppermost part where the river divides along the Fischerinsel. It's an area where people actually live. The other parts are more coined by representation. And here we want to try to improve the structural quality of the river or have a contribution to that. So I want to guide you through the 3 elements of or the 3 segments of this project. In the name-giving swimming section, the main thing is to grant access to that canal, because it's enclosed by high walls on either side, so you cannot actually get into the water even if it's clean. Altogether, the project tries to do as little as possible, so it tries to make use of this former piece of infrastructure and transform it, but by as little construction as possible. So here the construction is limited to the idea of having staircases and bring people into and out of the water, and some minimal infrastructure, including cold water showers and changing facilities. So here is the start of the swimming section on the Foreign Ministry on the left-hand side, and the former Staatsratsgebäude, today's economic school, ESMT. You see this staircase on the right-hand side and the swimming infrastructure on the water level inside the canal. View from the other side in the other direction. Second staircases to grant access to the water, and a third staircase in front of the Humboldt Forum, which was just completely opened last week in Berlin, this reconstructed castle. This staircase actually is the first element of the project that is becoming reality, even if in different format, but this is the plans of the landscape architects who won the competition for the surrounding of the Humboldt Forum, and this element will be constructed as a first element to get to the water and hopefully soon then also into the water. In former times, we had a central idea of granting access to the water, which was a very large staircase at Lustgarten, so just in front of the dome at the Schinkel Museum, but this turned out to become quite to be rather unrealistic, looking at the concerns of heritage protection. So we're not allowed to have a staircase here, and then there is swimming alongside the museum island, and on the other side of the swimming section, so 840 meters away, you have a second possibility to get inside the water. It's a temporary one where we think we just try to make use first before we further develop how it could look like. This is taking into account also here again the concerns of heritage protection. So it's a floating structure which can be pulled into the canal, grant access to the water, have minimal infrastructure, and then you can swim the distance of altogether 1.5 kilometers throughout the city. Second section is the filter section. Why do we need that? It looks like this. It was transformed quite a bit throughout this year. It became much simpler. The filter used to be the full width of the river. Now it's only the strip on the side of the canal. Filtration of water becomes necessary because Berlin, as many other cities in the world, or most other cities in the world, has a mixed sewage system. And mixed sewage was a concept of the 19th century, inventing canal system to the urban fabric. And it means that you have one system to collect rainwater and the disposed water from the households and the industry. And then it's being pumped to the treatment plants and is pumped back into the system once it's treated. That works perfectly well unless if it rains too much. When it rains very heavily, the capacity of that system is just outmaxed and the canal system spills into the river without any treatment. And that looks like that. And I don't think I need to describe what you see here. It's very smelly and it's what you put in the toilet. So that's why we need treatment. That's happening about 30 times per year, 15 to 30 times per year, that we have this catastrophe of the river really turning very, very bad, even though we know that the water in usual times is quite good. So we have been running a research program which ended last year, a floating laboratory on filtration, of natural filtration of the river water included in this old freight ship here. And the results of that program allowed us to simplify the project quite a bit. That's why we were able to reduce the heaviness of the construction of the filtration area quite a bit. And but we also learned something, and what we learned is that the water is much better than anticipated. So the times when the sewage system is not overflowing, the water quality of the river is actually quite good. You could go swimming without any problem. So this is really a situation where we as mankind fuck up the system, and which of course needs to be changed. The last section at the uppermost part of the river used to be filtration as well in the very beginning of the project, when we had no money and no resources to get specialist engineers on board and to calculate a filtration system like that. We thought that we need all that distance for filtration, and that turned out to be too big, and so this part was a leftover in that system. And here the approach is, as I said, it's an area coined by urban dwelling. And so here actually people are living. It's not like in the part with the museum island or the foreign ministry, which is all coined by representation. But here the project tries to do two things. One thing is to bring people into contact with the water who are living there, so to establish contact to water. And an aerial photography, so you see these housing blocks from the GDR time here. And the second thing is to establish an element that tries to contribute to the overall structural quality of the river as such, and that is by implementing shallow water zones alongside the canal, which you can see here. There is a wooden gangplank which is floating in front of the existing canal wall. There's areas where you grant access to get in contact with the water, and these shallow water zones are just very important for flora and fauna to find their spaces for reproduction inside these fully canaled former rivers in the urban fabric. So this is habitat construction in a way, which could look like this one day. So the project tries to unlock the potential of this former piece of infrastructure, this 1.8 kilometer long shipping canal, which is very prominently in the city center, but at the same time, it's a void. It's trying to question today's concept of exclusively treating the urban rivers as means of transportation. In Germany, all these rivers are treated as highways, basically, for shipping. And so nothing else is allowed. You're not only allowed to go through Berlin on the river with a ship and a motor. And but is that the concept of the future? If we look at the situation today, we see that over 90% of the ships that move through Berlin are basically entertainment, you could say, because it's tourists looking at the city on big ships that are going through the city center. So we think it's time to end this practice and to include an element in the city to rethink the use of these waterways as a means of recreation, as a means of ecological transformation, but also as a means of urban development, which it used to be in former times. So we try to implement a possibility for people to activate themselves, to go swimming in the city center. We think that a project like this could contribute to the overall situation today, that the city center is coined by a very homogeneous group of people, and we think it might be good to bring authentic life back to the city center and to bring tourists into contact with locals. We want to bring people in touch with the water, something they have forgotten for a long period of time, because most people in Berlin don't even know what the problem is with the water, because they have not been trained anymore to make use of it, because it's such a long time that the river is away from the city, which from the people, which of course is also connected to the fact that the river in Berlin was part of the division between East and West. So it's a multiple layer situation. And by bringing people in contact with water to establish maybe something tangible, which makes understandable what a sustainable development of the urban fabric or the city centers could look like, and what kind of benefit you could actually gain from it. So this is an advertising campaign from the city of Berlin, trying to show at the CO2 neutral future of the city. So there's not much idea around of how to transport ideas like that and to make them tangible or feelable. So and we think that might be a good location alongside the Museum Island to do so in the very city center, to bring people in contact around a discussion like that, because it's in the end, as Museum Island, of course, also a location where we discuss our future values, how we would like to live together. So a perfect location to actually kickstart a discussion in society. And of course, it's not new at all. People did go swimming in the past. So this is a photography from the original castle when it was still standing, from 1890. And these two floating structures that you can see up front, they were swimming facilities or cleaning facilities at these times. People didn't have a bathroom at home, so they were using facilities like that to clean themselves. So you can imagine it was floating structures. You had a little cabin inside. You could go inside, lock the door. You had a hole in the ground with a basket. You could go get undressed and clean yourself and go out again. But there were also real swimming facilities like this one, which is just exactly in our project area. This was it's the only photography existing of the supposedly most beautiful swimming facility in the River Spree. There was over 30 of them. This was really about swimming. The Werderische Doppelbadeanstalt opened in 1897, and this is actually in the backyard of the Staatsratsgebäude in Berlin, so just opposite of the Foreign Ministry. And we have rented this piece of land from the business school today, where we have our Flussbad Garden, a year-long year-round exhibition on the urban project. And in summertime, it's activated by cafe and by events around the urban transformation of Berlin and the sustainable development of Berlin, with a lot of discussions. We use it as academy space to train people about the backgrounds of the problems we have, because people don't know. Kids are a very good target for that, because they tell their parents when they have dinner, and they faint when they turn to understand what the problem is with our river. And we try to do other means of activation, like Flussbad Pokal is an event we have been trying to do since 2015. It's not allowed to go swimming there today because it's a shipping route officially, even though there's no ships anymore. And of course, we have the water quality issue, so we need to understand, is the water good enough to go swimming? So that was the attempt to bring people into contact with the water by mimicry of a sporting event. So it's a race, a swimming race we try to establish every year. We were successful in 2015, 2016, and 2018 so far. 2017 failed because of bad water quality due to heavy rains just before the event. 2019 failed due to bad water quality, and 2020 and ongoing is a mixture of COVID pandemic and the reality that the Senate in Berlin, who is responsible to give us permission to do so. They, in the past, they said we don't need to give you permission because it's not a real event. It's like off the track and so on. And now they are investigating on the legal limits of us going swimming since 2.5 years, and try to understand if it's legal or if it's not legal. We are still working on that, so that's kind of continuing. That's a quite successful event, actually. The last Flussbad Pokal, where we had registration open, in the end had over 800 registered swimmers. And of course, there's people there who are really competing to do a swimming race, but most of these people come in order to experience the city from a different perspective. So that was pretty much exactly 1 hour, which was given to me. I hope it was not too confusing for you. It was touching a lot of different areas of our work which don't really seem to relate to each other, but somehow do, I think. As I said, a lot of them are born by discovering potentials in your surrounding and try to make use of them, and we still do work like that. Financially, that's not very, very wise to do, but regarding the fun, sometimes it still is. Tschüss.
I have the mic, so I get to ask the first question, because I just wanted to kind of understand, because I think it could be important, going back to the club days, like the very beginning of like the studio, the space you had. And you can correct me, but I have a feeling the way you thought about swimming in Spree was like, okay, the party's over, let's go out, it's like day already. And like, would be cool to go for a swim, as a kind of idea, as a kind of event. Let's go swimming, almost as a kind of happening. But how much of the kind of gravity or the kind of seriousness of this Flussbad Berlin did you anticipate at that point when you actually came up with the idea? Okay, let's go for a swim. Thinking of like all the kind of, we understand the complexity of the project now, but how much of it did you actually think about then?
Yeah, you're wrong, actually. It was not a party idea, not at all. It was rather it's a super complex project. The idea is super simple, but it's super, super complex, and it's also super complex in discussion. There's not only people who like the project, there's people who try to find against this project by any means that you can imagine. Any means includes things like that they try to prove that we misuse public money within the project. So much anger is behind the idea to implement such a simple, authentic piece alongside world heritage in the city center. So the offspring of this project was not a party idea, but it was actually caretaking of the city. My brother was the one to start thinking about the canal. And the idea to use it for swimming is obviously on the table quickly when you think about there's waterways, what could you do with it? But the motivation behind it was very, very much connected to this idea of how could we implement something which keeps the city center alive in the future. Because what we see today is like really most part of the Spree Island are now representation. It's Museum Island. It's growing on the other shores of the Sprees on each side. So it's all kind of very beautiful, it's public, it's heavy, it's culture, it's so cool. But it's not authentic. There is no life anymore. And I think that was the kernel of this project to really see, can't we find something at a time where you also have to say in the late 90s, every square centimeter of the city center was argued about. How should the city center look like in the future? And the water or the waterways were not included because they had been excluded for such a long time from the map of potential in Berlin that nowadays we still have the problem that you can actually not include the river as a means of urban design because it belongs to the federal government. It doesn't belong to Berlin. We wrote a letter to the mayor, buy the river, you know, get the river back to Berlin, because there would be so much potential behind it if Berlin could use it in its interest. And the little bit of transportation for coal or other construction things in Berlin that we have, we can have that happening at nighttime, for instance, and say at daytime, the river is for the people. And it's not a transportation route or highway. So,
can I continue on this? Because I think the project is something really for Tallinn to learn from. Because I don't know if you noticed when you landed in the airport, next to that there's a lake. That's where all our tap water is coming from. And I think Tallinn is the only city in the world that has 1/3 of the capital city center fenced off. Because it's a tap water, no one can go near that. And the whole coastline that could be an additional 17.6 kilometers of coast is actually not really given to a public use. Even though, because they're afraid of this being polluted, because it is a tap water, and but they don't mind the fact that there's car trafficking next to it. There's planes, heavy plane traffic over it, but they are not willing to open it for public for walk or for example, swimming. So I'm wondering if to approach it another way around, that we have a really clean water and we want to keep it clean because you have this polluted water and you wanna get it clean. I'm wondering if there's anything that we can or what you can conclude out of your almost over 20 years of doing this project. Is there ways of fast forwarding some kind of processes? Did you learn something that you can forward to us in that terms, like how to deal with the municipalities, how to deal with public, or is it all about creating the image and how to get rid of the meta data that is in our heads saying that we can't drink where we swim in, or it can't be open to public? So I'm wondering, have you learned anything that we can somewhat pour or take over?
I wish I would have a simpler answer, I'm afraid I do not. And that's also because I think the process is still so dynamic. And in the very beginning, you know, it was like a private project. We kind of published it as once in a while, and it was shown in exhibitions. Then there was this Lafarge-Holcim Award, and suddenly it became part of the discussion in the city center, in the society. And then we got public funding. And with public funding, we were very lucky. We received a lot of money to further develop this project on a conceptual level, which is not very usual to happen, you know, that you have funds to actually further develop on concept stage, not planning. We have not entered planning stage on this project. It's still an idea for the city. The planning needs to come afterwards. But even though it's so simple, it's so complex to basically get into these rigid structures behind fencing lakes and rivers and transportation and so on, and the walls between local governments and federal governments and so on. That's all connected to a project like that. And of course, it's also connected to political will. When we got our first funding in 2014 from a national program in Berlin, it's called a national program in Germany, Nationale Projekte des Städtebaus, National Projects of Urban Redevelopment, which allows to also do conceptual projects. The project was carried by a vast majority of the different parties that were in the chamber in Berlin. So they all kind of thought, cool idea, we can go swimming, transformation of the city and so on. Now, that's nearly 10 years ago, you know. Now a lot of them realize it's connected to problems, and a lot of these problems are connected to deep structures, you know, down there. And so suddenly, depending on how elections go, this comfortable situation also starts to change, which we are in right now. So even though we have the same parties, we have a Green Party, which is in full support of this project. The Conservative Party is in full support of this project. The Liberals are in support of this project. The Social Democrats were the ones we started under, and now they have new people on the top. And they have a different agenda, which is a historic reconstruction of the city center. And so they hate us. You know, suddenly you have people on the other side who hate you and who try to prevent a project like that becoming reality, even though they have the senator for urban redevelopment in the city, and this Senate gives money to us to further develop the project. So it's a complete psycho situation, you know. It's like on one side you get money, on the other side they try to make you fall over and fail. So, but that's only 4 more years. Then we have new elections, maybe quicker, so that we will survive that as well. To be honest, I think one thing I can say is that I think this idea of trying to do slow activation, like the Flussbad Pokal, we continuously try to make become reality. That's something which is very valuable to actually make people start doing something, because and that's also the strategy that we are following right now. We are trying to get rid of the legal issues we have by getting into the water. That's we're putting a lot of energy in right now. We put a lot of energy right now into understanding how the water quality is in real time. So we have collected all this water data over years now, which gives us the foundation to actually evaluate water in real time. There's a research program on that happening in Berlin from a Kompetenzzentrum, like there's a group of research institutes working together on a project like that, and they collaborate with us. And the idea is that we go swimming without construction, and rather try to do that quickly. Then when I say quickly, my 3 years. 3 years.
25th anniversary.
Maybe that works.
Hi. I have a bit more general question about, well, it seems that your projects over time have been both projects of architecture and urbanism, but also partly projects of contemporary art, right? So I'm wondering, how do you see the relationship between contemporary art and contemporary architecture? Because it seems to me that they are there's kind of an inherent conflict of ideals, because for contemporary art, one of the ideals is to push people out of their comfort zone, whereas for contemporary architecture, it's one of the ideals is to make it as human-centric as possible, as fitting in with the existing context as possible, as comfortable as possible. So how do you balance between these differences?
Very good question. Yeah, it's difficult. I think it's difficult. It's a challenge, but it's also it's very exciting, to be honest, because I think in this overlapping field, something happens which is not possible in either of the professional worlds. And I would say, like, we are not artists, we are not artists and we are not architects, neither, you know, and we are not allowed to kind of really play architects. We're not being taken serious by the real architects. And of course, we are also not being taken serious by the art world. We have not even studied art. But that creates a freedom to do things which neither one would do because of their inherent limits of the professions. And I think that's exactly where sometimes the potentials linger around to do something which would be impossible in either of these worlds, and to sometimes even unlock spaces which are locked beforehand. And so I think it's a bit we are not afraid to make our hands dirty, I would say. So we do things which you would not do if you're like a real artist. You would never do that because it's even to think to do something which could be useful in a sense is again the idea of what art is supposed to do, right? Maybe that's also shifting, you know, I put a question mark in the space. But so I think it's more something to discover and to learn from. And so I think we are bouncing in between.
Great, thanks.
One more question, if anyone wants to. So who gets to ask?
So I wanted to ask a question based on the three designs of the buildings that you showed. In the first one, Kunst house, over there you had like a very deliberate sort of a effort of using fluorescent lights instead of like spotlights, and it was like quite in a sense that it wasn't making like a big spectacle out of it. And I was just thinking that if you look at other buildings and the way that you have used like the media facade, which is like really spectacular, how do you now reflect back on the buildings that you made in terms of a society that is like increasingly saturated with images and spectacles, and in this attention economy where you know your relationship with images have really changed?
Yeah, let's put it like that. For me, the Kunsthaus project was always a public laboratory to research on language. You know, language in the world of architecture that suddenly has a capability to talk or to communicate. And I think we did quite a lot to move it outside of the realm of like advertising or the images that you're probably referring to, or even like the technical means that are now available to transform any surface in the built surrounding to become carrier of images. And actually, I don't even like media facades, and I don't like the word or the phrase media facade. It relates, for my concern, very much to this commercial overtaking of public space and the limitations that are connected to that. And also, like, if you look in parallel, for us, as I said, it was like a laboratory to try to do things at that time, which were exciting. And I think it's maybe paying into developments which might be coming in the future, that we do experiments, or that we have done experiments like that. But of course, it's connected to a lot of questions, like who has the right to radiate images into public space, and who's receiving them, and how you're being brainwashed or not brainwashed, and so on. So, of course, we were specifically there looking at a setting where our hope was that the art world would be a safe space to do something like that, commercial free, so like for the good thing, for the good development. And right now, I think parallel, you see, of course, the whole discussion about sustainability and the energy crisis we are seeing now, and so on. Of course, you could not think projects like that today anymore. It's impossible. It's like we could never do a project like that today. It's impossible. And I think it all has its time. And as I said, I think it has a certain relevance in regards to research on how architecture becomes dynamic or can be transformed, or has a notion which is not static anymore, which is otherwise the usual impression we have of the built environment. And I think that is further developing, I'm quite sure. Because buildings are more and more augmented by technology, and also looking at things or at developments like climate change and shortness of energy, of course, I think that's going to become more and more, because right now we are still in the stage of trying to control. And I think it will take a long time until people try to let loose, and say maybe the time of control is over and we need to live in a different way again. The concept of having enclosed buildings that are climatized in all sections is something that we could question. Is it taken for granted that this is the right concept of how to live? Or could we imagine that buildings in the future might also include zones which are not climatized and which are only partially protected, like rain protected and so on, in order to make life possible? But I think that's in the far future. I don't know if it's a sufficient answer to your question.
Yes, so it's a quick one. I think it's quite interesting that you found yourself to try to evade the tourists in the very beginning with the bar, and now you're kind of finding yourself in opposition to them again. And what I wanted to ask is, if you see, it's kind of a polemic question, do you see the Flussbad as somehow a quest of reclaiming the city center from the tourists and giving it back to the residents of Berlin?
No. It's a misunderstanding. I'm not against tourists at all. They're all welcome very much in Berlin. Please come. No, I really understand a project like Flussbad as a means of creating contact zones, which enable you to actually meet tourists or to meet locals. We do not have that many, like the typical people who do a touristic program in Berlin maybe when they're young and they go to Berghain, then you have a chance to talk to them, but otherwise it's not really going to happen because you don't go to a museum very often and so on. So it's limited, and they all kind of live in their own sphere. And I think that would be the interesting aspect of a project like that the people who come out of the museum and the locals who go for a swim actually meet and mingle. And I don't know what the result would be, but I think it would be interesting. That's what I'm hoping for. So it's not against tourists, not at all. I hope that all of the tourists will go swimming there when they come out of the museum.
You have been pitching this to the city government.
No.
No, you should.
It's also difficult. It will be, everything that we say is being turned against us. If we say it's going to be a successful project for tourists, they say, see, it's going to be the overuse of the museum island. We cannot have more people there. It's dangerous. It will endanger the status of the World Heritage of the museum island. That's how it's being argued. So be very careful with your argument.
Jan, we want to thank you with another applause.